Okay, so we are, in light of this past Sunday being Resurrection Sunday, I thought it was only fitting that we look at the resurrection of Jesus a little bit more. Often we get to Resurrection Sunday comes and we just move on. And there's so much richness in those resurrection passages that we don't really get into, that you can't get into in the Sunday service. So my intention is for the next couple of weeks that we will look at these resurrection narratives and kind of see how each one of these writers teach us different things about Jesus's resurrection. And so tonight, what we'll do is we'll look at Matthew's story of the resurrection. And I intentionally say story of the resurrection because the resurrection is a part of the larger story of Jesus. You can't isolate it. It has to come in that narrative, right? It only makes sense when we understand it within the narrative of Jesus, that each one of these gospel writers tells. And what you also see is that each writer, some of the themes that they have within their narrative also pop up in their story about Jesus's resurrection. And so we'll look at that today. We'll look at Matthew's story of the resurrection. And so we're going to start at chapter 27, verse 57, and then we're going to work our way through 28, 1 through 15. That's when we get the two Marys at the tomb. And then we'll conclude with 28, 16 through 20, because that is kind of the conclusion, right? What we find in what we call the so-called Great Commission in chapter 28, verses 16 through 20 is directly related to the resurrection. Amen. If there's no resurrection, there's no commission. And what we'll see is that Jesus has to go through that in order to do what he does in 28, 16 through 20. He can't send the disciples. He doesn't have the authority until he goes through his death and resurrection. So we'll end there. So we'll start, like I said, 27, 57, and we'll work our way all the way through, all the way to what we call the Great Commission. Reading this kind of as a story, kind of within its narrative flow. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's start. Matthew 27, verse 57 through 60. Let's look at 57 through 61 first. We're going to start here, which is after Jesus he's already been crucified. He dies on the cross. And once he dies, if you read a little bit before this, Matthew introduces the women into the scene, who are kind of going to play the central roles going forward. But let's look at 27, verse 57 through 66. And what I have on the screen is a NIV version. As evening approached, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph. He had himself become a disciple of Jesus. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Question, who's Pilate? Pontius Pilate. Why is he even important in this thing? He's the governor. He's the Roman governor. Yeah. And so, under Roman rule, if they didn't have a local king of the people that they could trust, then they would put a governor over it. And so what happened is once King Herod dies, his sons prove that they're not able. A governor goes over this region, what we call Judea. And that's why Pilate is there, right? So Pilate is there. He's the Roman power that's there ruling over the region. So Joseph goes to Pilate and he asks for Jesus' body, and Pilate ordered that it be given to him. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it in his own new tomb. I have new tomb underlined. We're going to come back to that he had cut out of the rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance of the tomb and went away. Verse 61, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary was sitting there opposite the tomb. So what we already see is that within this text, right, within this burial of Jesus, well, when Joseph goes and gets the body, buries Jesus, Matthew's already signaling where we're going to be going as we go forward with a couple of things. That new tomb, this big stone, but particularly verse 61, right? You kind of got this line that's thrown in there. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb, right? Those are the two people that are going to be the central people in the narrative going forward, but they kind of just slide in here towards the end of this passage. So, key thing, note I have underlined, as evening approached. Why would that be significant? Does anybody remember when Jesus dies? He dies when? What day is it? What day of the week? Friday. It's a Friday, right? And does anybody know what happens once evening comes on Friday in Jewish tradition? That's Sabbath, right? So why does Jesus need to get off that cross before evening is approaching? It's Sabbath. If Sabbath comes, he's not coming down. He don't have to be up there. There's going to be a whole bunch of problems, right? So evening, that signaling that evening is approaching, it's important to get him off of there and get him buried because Sabbath is coming, which is one of the reasons why the women can't go and put the spices on before Sunday because it's not enough time. By the time he gets in the tomb, it's Sabbath, time to go back home, rest for the Sabbath, all right? So we're already kind of signaling these temporal things of why then we're going to get these 3 days. So the women are introduced in the narrative, and one of the things I have here is I have underscored this new tomb. And I want you to just think about that and just log that in the back of your mind. Why is it so important that this tomb is new? Why is that little detail included there? Close reading, always pay attention to little details. Why add that, right? Could have just say placed them in his tomb, but they made sure to say that it was a new tomb. We're going to come back to that. And we know what the big stone is there to seal the tomb, to close it up, make sure nobody gets in, right? Because you're not really worried about nobody coming out. The problem is if anybody coming out, probably somebody getting in there, right? That's why the stone is there, okay? So what would that look like? So sometimes these pictures are a little bit hard to make out, but maybe, sorry. Let me see if I can get no. Okay, so these pictures here, I'm sorry, those who are on their phone, you can't see it, but these pictures here are actually from Jerusalem, outside of what we call the old city of Jerusalem. Old city of Jerusalem is where Jesus would have get killed at. That's where the temple is, all those things, right? And this picture on the left, it is actually a tomb. It used to be covered, but it had been excavated. So the cave that would have covered where the bodies are laid has been removed. But what I want you to look is, if you can look real closely, does anybody see these little indentions here? Y'all see that? That's where the bodies were laid. So when you had these tombs, these weren't just tombs for one person to be in. These were family tombs, right? And so this is what Joseph's tomb would have looked like. It would have been a family tomb, and you have these little places here for each one of the bodies to lay in. You have the head here. This tomb had 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you look over here, 5, then if you look here, that was 1. There's 1 here also back on that corner. So 6. And what would happen is they put the bodies in here, wrap them up real good, put them in there, let them sit there. Once they, decompose, turn into bones, somebody else from your family die, you go in there, you take those bones, slide them down here in this little plate. There's a little indention. Come, put the old bones there, put the new person on top, right? So often when the Bible talks about a person is collected they're gathered with their ancestors, they mean that literally. They mean that literally. Like all your ancestors' bones are gathered underneath there, and you just put your body, your family's members' bodies in there. So that's what the tomb would have looked like. If you look at the picture on the right, this is the tomb. This is another tomb that's covered. So the one on the left would have been like the one on the right, but it's been excavated, right? So the outside is gone. This one, the outside is still there. You see this little round thing right there? That's a stone. And that stone would be rolled right there, and you cover it. These are first century tombs in Israel. So this is what one of the tombs that Jesus would have been placed in. It would have been similar to this. So Jesus is placed in one of those tombs, right? So this is where we are in the story. He's there. The women are standing. They see. They got to get home, though, because you know what? It's about to be Sabbath. We're good Jewish women. We observe the Sabbath. Can't do no work. Can't be touching dead bodies and all this kind of stuff on the Sabbath. Go home, right? Look at this. The next day, the one after preparation day, preparation for the Sabbath, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate, right? So first you get Joseph of Arimathea. He goes to Pilate, says, can we get the body? Now we got the chief priests and the Pharisees, those who've always been after Jesus, wanting to take him out. They go to Pilate this time. Now let's look at that thing. 63. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days, I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, look at this, his disciples might come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first, right? What's the first deception? First deception is that he's running around calling himself the Son of God, the Messiah, saying that God has sent him, right? This is why Jesus dies, right? Because they contest his claim. They say he's blaspheming, right? That's important. That's important when we go to the resurrection, right? If Jesus if he's not raised, then that means that they were right. So they said, the last deception would be worse than the first. This is Pilate. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone, posting the guard there, right? So you got the stone seal, most likely probably from the Roman governor's seal, like a little, indention that you place on there to know if anybody had moved it, that seal would have to be broken, right? So you got the seal and you got the guard there. Look what they call Jesus, though. What do they call him? A deceiver, right? Hold on to that, because this idea of deception is going to pop back up a little bit later on, right? And then we're going to see a bit of irony with that term, right? But he's called a deceiver. And so the question that I have here is, what would an empty tomb mean for the religious leaders? So if the religious leaders were to go to the tomb in 3 days, right? If they didn't do this and they went to the tomb and they saw that the tomb was empty, what would they think? That's an important piece, right? So because as Christians, so much of how we understand these stories is already filtered through our belief. It's already filtered through our confession, our belief in Jesus, and all this kind of stuff. So we don't often question the way somebody living in this time would have questioned. There would have been only a small amount of people that would have actually believed that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Even his own disciples, they wouldn't have believed that he rose from the dead if they didn't see a body. Does that make sense? So this idea that somebody may have stolen Jesus' body, that's a very, very real thing, particularly during Matthew's time when he's writing, which is why that comes up. You read the other gospels, they don't say that. They don't even have this story. Yes.
Well, I believe for some Jewish people, they believe that he was stolen. It wasn't really it wasn't a miracle. The resurrection didn't happen. So that's really the basis of their belief. What my understanding.
Well, not that some, we do know that at least from the way Matthew frames it, it's very clear that some people believe that the body was stolen. So that's true. I think the bigger thing you're going to have nowadays is just people don't believe that he was raised. You know, we live in a very like technologically and scientific age. The idea that somebody could raise from the dead goes against science. So that's a big issue that even some believers, if you really, really boil down to it, they have a hard time believing that. When I teach my New Testament class, when I get into the historical Jesus, I have one lecture on this resurrection. And we read articles from scholars who believe that Jesus raised and those who don't. You'd be surprised. The vast majority of the class don't necessarily believe that he had a bodily resurrection, right? Some people believe that, well, maybe it was like, kind of like, you know, his spirit, and that's what they saw, right? It wasn't necessarily his physical body, but it was like his ghost, right? You know, and when we look at Gospel according to Luke, they know that, which is why certain things happen after he rises up, right? And so some of us can easily accept this idea of resurrection, but that's not, it's a hard thing to accept if you just think about it a little bit more critically. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The miracle birth. That could be true. That's, you know, that one typically doesn't cause as many problems as the resurrection. Resurrection causes problems, like even for just Bible scholars, they struggle with that because who else has ever been resurrected before like this? So it's just a tricky one, you know, in terms of that. And so it really, and then I'll make this last point and move on. You know, there is no hard, fast historical evidence to prove it. It can't be proved factually and scientifically. We can't prove the resurrection. And so it really at some point becomes a faith thing. The hardcore evidence that we have is the empty tomb. That's the thing that's consistent across the tradition. The question becomes, why is the tomb empty? And we're going to get to that even within this text. So how do Pilate and the religious leader guard against that deception? What do? Seal it, put a guard, right? So we're already setting, if you read it like this, you already see how the story is setting up. You got the women, they see where Jesus has been placed. You got these religious leaders that come and say, hey, you need to seal that thing, put a guard there, right? All of this is moving us towards that Sunday morning, putting all these things in place, right? Roman seal, Roman guards. That's what's going on at that tomb. All right. Any questions about those two passages so far? Let's look at, now let's jump to the actual resurrection narratives, starting at chapter 28, verses 1 through 15. We're going to split this up, though. We'll look at verses 1 through 7, then we'll end, then we'll look at 8 and 10, then we'll jump 8 through 10, then we'll jump over to the next part. Okay. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. Consistent in the tradition are these two Marys across the board. They're there, which is very interesting because, which you know is historical also, because if you really want to have a credible, in the ancient world, if you really wanted to have a credible story, you probably don't want women being the main ones who tell it.
Why is that?
Huh? In the ancient world? Because women's the testimony of women didn't carry the same kind of weight as a man. It was a male-centered society. And so that's one of the interesting things about the Christian tradition is that the ones who actually tell the story are the women, right? In so many ways, it's already subverting that stereotype. But that also is one of the reasons why we know that's a very, very strong tradition. What I mean, tradition means that that's something that goes all the way back to the early, most likely this is how it really happened. Those women were the first ones there. Because men controlling things, if they could change it, it would be some men there, not those women, right? And we'll see later on how that tradition even gets played with. But they show up. Look at verse 2. There was a violent earthquake for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it, right? So here we go. They're going to the tomb, and most likely they know that they got one problem, maybe two. The first problem that they know is that that stone is going to be there. They may not know that this guard is going to be there, but that guard ain't going to let them go in there, right? He's there to guard the tomb so that nobody can go in, right? But they go anyway. And God goes ahead of them, right? Rolls the stone away and sits on it. And if you know, this is another thing when I say, when we read these resurrection narratives, themes or elements that are in the earlier part of the gospel also show up here. And this idea about the angel coming and being the one who reveals what's going on in that tomb to them is already in Matthew's narrative. To your point, Deacon Nobles brought up the birth narrative. Who is it that comes to Joseph and say, hey, don't divorce her? It's the angel, right? So this idea that these angels are the ones who kind of mediate between the people and reveal to them what God is doing is part of how Matthew tells the story. And it shows up right here in this text, right? And the angel is important, right? So he comes, he rolls back, his appearance was like lightning and his clothes was white as snow. They're really just filling out the picture, like this is that kind of splendor that comes with being a part of the heavenly chorus, right? Verse 4, the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Do I put that in here? Yep, okay. Okay, so they shook like dead men, right? The angel says to the women, don't be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. Let me stop there, because look at the irony that goes on here. That's what I love about the story, right? They're going to see Jesus, who they think is dead, but he's alive. But who ends up being quote unquote dead? The guards. It's another, right? Like they're telling the story, you know, these gospel writers, they had a bit of a sense of humor, right? They're going to the place. Jesus is not the one that's dead, but it's the guards who end up quote unquote like dead men. It was the climate of the era that women weren't observed with having a voice. This is why today the debate about being here. So yes. So Brother Sean says, you know, to that point, the women, women, I will say this. In the early church, the women had a significant presence and they were leaders. They were deacons. It's there in the tradition. Go read Romans chapter 16. What happens as the church progresses, the women's voice becomes suppressed. It becomes suppressed. So by the time you get later on in early Christianity, the women have no leadership roles. It's all controlled by men. But that wasn't what it was at first. It wasn't. Just read Paul's letters. It's all over the place. Most of those house churches were led by women. Who were the first ones at the tomb? Women. That's my point. If they could get, but they can't. It's too much in the tradition. So to your point, it wasn't that the women didn't have a voice, they did. But as the church grows and it becomes more authoritative, more hierarchical, the women's voice gets suppressed. Okay. But that's a whole nother, we can talk about that another time. That's a whole nother, it's there though. Okay. So they're coming, the guards are like dead. Why? Because they're afraid, right? But what does the angel say to the women? Don't be afraid, right? It's okay if those guys are afraid, but you not be afraid because I'm here to tell you something, right? God said, don't be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. That's a key thing. Before I get to the disciples part, it's important that that they look and see where they lay, because that's the evidence that the tomb is empty. Why do you need the angel there? If the women just show up and the tomb is empty, what do they think? I mean, who's ever read John's resurrection narrative? You remember that? When John, you got Mary, she shows up to the garden tomb. There's a gardener there. And what does she say? I can't, somebody's what? Taking him, right? This is why you need the angel. So if you don't have an angel there, then you don't know what his body is, and nobody's thinking that body ain't got up, right? And this is why even when you read the Gospels, when Jesus is telling the disciples that he's gonna die and be raised, what do they always say? They couldn't understand. They don't understand. They still didn't understand even when it happened. Why do you think none of the disciples are at the tomb? They going somewhere hiding, thinking they about to get killed next, because they didn't believe. They didn't. So you need the angel there because the angel is interpreting what the empty tomb means. Body hasn't been stolen, but Jesus didn't get knocked out. And then, when he got placed there, he came to and walked away. Like some people, people come up with all kind of things to try to explain why this tomb was empty. But the angel there comes to reveal why it's empty, because he's what? Risen. Remember. Yep, that's right. But unfortunately, they don't remember. Okay. He's risen. He's not here. He's risen, just as he said, but nobody believed. Nobody understood. Then he says, come look at it. That's why they have to go in. That's why they have to see. Now you get the commission. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you, right? That's the first bit. You need the angel to come and say, look at the empty tomb. Let me help you understand what that means. He's risen. Now I need you to go tell the disciples, right? So who are the first ones that actually preached the good news of the resurrection? Wasn't any man. Okay. So when we talked about the Joseph of Arimathea text, I said that the gospel writers are intentional in saying that this was a new tomb. Why do you think that's important? That's a good point, right? And that's like, from a holiness standpoint, yep, nobody else deserves to be in this tomb. I think that's a good point. And I think that could be part of it. What'd you say? You had clean linen. Yep.
I think that it's never been moved, the blocks have never been moved around, nice and like everything should be nice and tight and they seal it up.
Yep, I think that's a point. I think this is all great, right? And largely what we do is when we read the story, we read it already being convinced of who Jesus was, right? So if we're already convinced that Jesus is the Messiah, that we know he's going to rise from the grave, there's going to be a certain level of reverence that we think is going to take place with his body. But if you're not sure that he is the Messiah, then you might not have that same kind of reverence, meaning that you might just want to find any grave, any tomb to put him in because Sabbath is coming and we need him off the cross, right? but I don't want to belabor y'all much. But I want you to think about it this way. Remember, I showed you that picture of those tombs, right? And in those tombs, were those tombs made for one person or multiple? Multiple. So if you have a tomb that has multiple bodies in it, how can it be empty? If there's bodies in there, how can it be empty? Could just be when you go in there, okay, it's like 6 people in here. Which one is he? Is he that one? That one? But if nobody's ever been in there, very easy. Either there's one body in there or it's not. So I think that's one of the reasons why the tomb is new. There's no body in there. Because there's no bodies in there, it's very, very easy to know that that tomb is empty. Does that make sense? I think that's one of the key, elements that's going on here. Yeah. Any questions about that? Any questions about that? Again, when we think, you really have to think about when the gospel writers are writing these things, they're writing these things to people, some that believe, but some that don't necessarily believe, some that might have doubts, some that might have heard other stories, right? So there's a certain kind of rhetorical way in which they tell the story to try to make sure that they close off all these potential loose ends, right? And one of them is this tomb that's empty. Does that make sense? And we'll get to this idea of belief and doubt in a little bit, right? That's important. Remember, I don't know if y'all remember this when we talked about Matthew's parables. One of the distinctive things about how Jesus tells parables in Matthew is that he often has these 2 groups, right? He's talking about the church, but there's always these 2 groups, right? You got the sheep and the goats, right? You got the wheat and the tare, right? So Matthew always has faith, people who believe and people who don't believe. They're always intermingled, right? And part of the story is that he's trying to challenge those who don't believe and warn them, hey, if you don't believe, this could be your ending. And he's trying to encourage those who do believe to continue to believe, right? And so the reason why I'm saying that these resurrection narratives, they're doing the same thing. They're trying to convince those who maybe don't believe that this is the truth, while also trying to affirm those who do believe that this is the truth. Does that make sense? Okay. So the women, and this is all part of what's going on with the women. So they come, they see the angel. The angel interprets the tomb, what it means that it's empty. Then he says, go and tell the disciples. What do they do? So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and do what? Ran to tell the. So we already know that they received that word in faith because they're actually doing what the angel told them to do. While they're on their way, what happens? They see Jesus, right? They actually see him in the flesh, right? So in obedience, they go. While they're going, Jesus appears to them. Greetings, he said. They came just nonchalant. Hey, how you doing? Like, hold on, what? I don't want to get sidetracked. But I always think, I try to imagine this, right? Like if you was there and you saw him die, like you saw him die, you saw him get put in the grave. And then, a couple of days later, you walking and you just see him walk like nothing happened. Like, so he just shows up, greetings, right? Look at their response. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped. which is the proper response to Jesus when you see him? Worship. Why do you think they clasp his feet? Here's another one of those details. It's like, why add that? Maybe, but like that becomes a thing for in John, right? Because Doubting Thomas, right? So we don't get the story about Doubting Thomas in Matthew. In John, we get the story about Doubting Thomas, and what does Jesus say? See that? Put your fingers in there. It's just nasty. Like, put your fingers in there. Thrust it in my side, right? He does this, right? They don't do that here. But I do think you're onto something there. I do think it has something to do with belief and doubt. Yep.
Maybe, they know that they need to be bowing and that they need to be at his feet to worship him properly.
That could be part. That could be part of that's part of their worship, that they go down and grab his feet. Yeah, I don't rule that out. I think that definitely is a part of it. I also think it's possible. Again, this is one of those details that you don't have to include that, but you do. So why? I do think it's possible also that this idea, was Jesus actually bodily resurrected, or was it like some kind of ghost? I do think that might be operating here. Do you think his appearance than how it was before? I don't think so. Yeah, I think so. I think he comes exactly how he was. I don't think anything has changed, like that he looks different or anything like that. I do think that the bodily resurrected means that body that went down is the same body that gets up. And that's a big thing too, this idea of bodily resurrection. Because you got some people that believe in resurrection, but they don't believe in a bodily resurrection, right? You can believe that a person's spirit is resurrected, right? So, but that body, the thing about Christianity, the thing about this Jesus story is that it's a bodily resurrection. What were you gonna do? Were you gonna say something, Minister Shirley?
Oh, that really. But now, since if they're clasping his feet and they can actually clasp his feet, maybe that's showing that it's a body,
yeah,
not a spirit.
Yeah. I think that might be part of it. Again, because you have these writers are interacting with very different ways in which people try to explain away what happened. So I do think that may be it. It could also just be that they went to worship, and because they worship, they bow down and they grasp his feet. That could be it.
One gospel in one narrative says, "Don't touch me, because I'm about to sing." So,
yeah, that's John.
Yeah.
That's John, which is, again, each gospel writer is telling that story a little bit different, right? John says that, but he don't do that in Matthew. Yeah, okay. So they worship, right? So they see him. Their response is to worship. They grasp the feet. And then look what he tells them. The exact same thing that the angel said, right? So what's the point? The point isn't just to see and worship, but to also go and tell, go spread the word. But it's a slight difference in what Jesus says. The angel in verse 7 says, "Go quickly and tell his disciples," right? He has risen from the dead. Jesus says, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell" what? "My brothers. Go to Galilee, there they will see me." And I think that idea of my brothers is already hinting at that restoration, right? Because these same brothers are the ones who left him hanging there when the police came, right? Police hit the house, they all shot and left him there, right? Peter followed for a little bit, but then as soon as the questioning got tight, he's like, "I'm out too," right? So they all abandoned him. right? And Jesus, though, he comes and he always restores them. And I do think that that's why that brother language is going on there, because now he's going right back to that family language, that familiar language, which is always a language about relationship. That's why the New Testament writers use the brothers and sisters. It's all about relationship. It's all about community. So he says the exact same thing, sends them on their way. So this is the first report. The first report is the women, they see the empty tomb. They interpret, the angel interprets what the tomb means, that Jesus has been raised. They believe that. And as they believe it and go, they actually see the risen Jesus, which is another thing going on too. You know, if we think about Matthew is what they call, quote unquote, the most Jewish gospel, means that he is really, really interacting with a lot of Jewish traditions, particularly from the Torah. And if you remember, in order to establish the credibility of a person's statement, do you know how many witnesses you're supposed to have? 2. How many witnesses do they get? 2. Everywhere you turn, they're all trying to clinch it really, really tight that he actually did rise from the dead. Any questions about that?
One of the gospels say that there are 3.
Yeah.
2 Marys.
Yep. And that's one of the tricky things. Which tradition are they using, right? And so the thing is, each one of the writers, they have different traditions. We know they have Mark, but then they have their own traditions too, their own stories that they got. And so sometimes those stories are different. And so how many women are at the tomb is one of those where the tradition gets really, really fuzzy, because some is 2, some is 3, another one is 1. But what's consistent is that it's the women that's there. So, but that's a good point. You know, for Matthew, it's just 2. Why? Is it because that the tradition he has only had 2 women? Possibly. Is it because that he's all about understanding how you really, really clinch the authority of a witness? You need 2, right? So we don't really know. We don't really know. But that's a good observation. That's one of the tricky things you see when you read them separately. Okay. The point is, the women give a report of faith, and that is Jesus has risen from the dead. Now let's look at the next report. This is verses 11 through 15. While the women were on their way, so look how the story transitions, right? So the women, they see Jesus, see the angel, they're going to tell the disciples that Jesus is risen. While they're going, some of the guards, you know, those who were like dead, they weren't dead. They were just like they were dead, right? They go to the city and they tell the chief priests the same thing that happened. They tell them there's an angel there, tomb empty. Tell them that. But look at the priest's response. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money. Here they go, paying off, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. Right? So here we go, these conflicting reports, right? 14. If the report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. That part, you know, when I read that part just, I was like, how does that make sense? If they're sleeping on a job and the body gets stolen, how is the governor going to be like, oh, okay, don't worry about that? No, the governor most likely going to be coming. But they probably could, the Jewish religious leaders probably could satisfy the governor, because ultimately the governor wants to make sure that they're satisfied, because the governor knows that if they kick up too much dust, cause too much trouble, that could cost him his head, right? That's the whole reason why the governor ends up giving Jesus over, right? Because he needs to satisfy the people. If the population are in the uproar and Rome finds out, they're going to be like, what's going on? the emperor sends some people down there, tell you to come back to Rome, you're in trouble, right? So the governor always got to keep things quiet, particularly in these provinces where stuff tends to bubble up. And Judea was one of those ones, right? So it's possible that they could satisfy him and keep the government straight and not allow the soldiers to get out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. Look at this. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Not necessarily our day, but to the day when Matthew was writing. That's why I say this idea that Jesus' body was stolen was a real problem that he has to deal with, which is why he tells the story the way he tells it. The way his resurrection story, the way he tells it, from the sealing of the tomb, from those guards, all that, the angel, Jesus, all is to counteract this idea that the disciples stole the body, but that Jesus actually did raise from the dead. So we see a different report. The women, a report of faith. Nope, Jesus rose from the dead. The disciples, the guards, a report of doubt, basically fed to him by the chief priests and the Pharisees, that he didn't rise, but his body was stolen. But they called him a deceiver. Ultimately, who are the ones who are deceiving them? Exactly. Here's another one of those another note of irony, right? For them, oh, he's the deceiver, right? They're gonna steal a body, but ultimately they're the ones who concoct the deception to try to lead people astray. Any questions about that? Those two texts go together. The women report and what we see with the guards in the fair, those two go together. They sit there juxtaposed to see two different interpretations of that empty tomb. Okay. So Jesus is risen, appears to the two Marys. They go and tell the disciples. Then you have the guards. They start spreading a false narrative that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. Then we get to Jesus finally appearing to the disciples. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee. We believe most likely that they go to Galilee. Why? Because the women told them that's where they should go, because that's where Jesus is going to meet them, right? They go to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. We're going to come to that. But I have underscored mountain. Why do you think that? Why do you think the mountain setting is significant, particularly in Matthew? Does anybody remember Matthew and these mountains? When Jesus gives that sermon in Matthew, where is he? It's on the mountain, right? Remember how I said how Matthew is all about recasting Jesus as this Moses figure? He's always going up on the mountain, giving these teachings. Look how the story ends. Where is Jesus at? Once again, he's on the mountain, right? He's on the mountain. He appears to them, but look at verse 17. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but what? Some doubted, right? And here goes that bifurcation that you find in Matthew within the church. Because remember, Matthew's writing this to the church, not writing this to people that don't believe. He's writing this to people who already believe the story. And even within the church, you got some that believe and some that doubt, even to the very end. Verse 18. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's the thing that we get from the death and resurrection, right? When you think about how does Jesus then get exalted to the Lord of all and have the authority, he gets there through his death, resurrection, and ascension. So when we think about something like Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, it tells us right there very, very clearly. I will pull it up, but I don't want to. I'll read it. I should have added that here because I think that's a key text. So if you think about Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, that's what we call one of the early hymns. Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. Being found in human form, here's the point. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross, right? So you get the death. That's what Jesus does. He humbles himself, allows himself to die on the cross. Verse 9, therefore, right, because he did this, God has done what? Highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus, every knee should bend in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. How does Jesus get exalted to lordship? It's through death and the resurrection. You see what I mean? So this is why the commission flows right out of the death and the resurrection. If you don't have the death and the resurrection, you don't get the commission. That's how he gets the authority. Look, all authority in heaven and on earth has what? Been given. That means that somebody did what? Gave it to him, right? When did he get that? From the Father, once he gets died, once he rises again, right? So once you get the resurrection, that's when he gets the authority. Then that's when he delegates, right? Therefore, now that I have this authority, you go and do what? Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you, right? That commission flows right out of the resurrection. Why? Because if you don't have a resurrection, then why should we be obeying anything that Jesus has commanded us? If you don't have that resurrection, then why would he even follow Jesus? That means that what he said wasn't true. But the resurrection validates all of his ministry, gives him the authority so that then we can go forth and preach. If you don't have no resurrection, then there's nothing for you to preach. But we got the resurrection, flow right out of that is the command to go forth and make disciples. And then we get that promise that we get at the very end. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age, right? So that's the conclusion of the story. But the resurrection is that pivot point, right? You get the death. And if you get the death and it ends there, the story's over. It's done. Like we got it all wrong, right? And we're going to see that when we look at Luke 24, right? We're going to see that because Luke actually has disciples say, look, we thought he was the one, but clearly he wasn't because he died, right? But once you get the resurrection, that's what then starts the movement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure is the church of his presence. Okay. Any questions before, any questions or comments on this? I know we did a split. Yep.
Well, you know, the fact too, that you have the resurrection, and this is kind of, and it tells you to go forth right out of the mouth of Jesus. And then when you stay having people to be saved, they have to believe Romans 10:9-10. That you believe you know how God raised Jesus raised from the dead, you will be saved. So, it's powerful.
Yeah. No, the resurrection is the thing, right? That's why the movement continues, because there were other people that came saying that they were messiahs before Jesus and during Jesus and even after Jesus' time. And they got killed.
Yeah.
And their movements died out, right? So even if you read Acts, I think chapter 4, you know, they have this, the religious leaders have this big debate. They was like, yeah, you know, that one Judas, that Galilean, he rose up. He had people, they followed him and he thought he was something, but the Romans killed him and the movement went away. And they was like, this was going to happen to them. But that's the difference, is that you got the resurrection.
Yeah.
And the resurrection is what kept it. I mean, that's why you still have a Christianity over 2,000 years later. something has to happen, right? Something, because it's hard to keep a lie going for 2,000 years. So that's a strong, even the most skeptical scholars of the resurrection believe those early followers saw something that allowed them to say, this man isn't dead. We need to keep spreading this word. Does that make sense? Okay, conclusion. The resurrection narrative, it concludes the story, right? When we read, it's the conclusion of the story. It's not just something that's just sat there by itself. You got to read it within the context of the whole narrative. You got to understand from the beginning what Jesus taught, what happens, then he rises. From the rising is the commissioning. The women witnessed the empty tomb and the risen Jesus, right? They're there, but they need those two things. They need the angel to tell them what that empty tomb means. Body didn't get stolen, but he's risen. Then they need to see Jesus. Once they see him, that's what clinches it, that the resurrection actually did happen. They respond with what? Worship and going to tell. Then you got the soldiers on the other hand, right? They have this, you have the counter narrative going. He wasn't raised, his body, the disciples stole his body, right? He wasn't raised, deceiving people. No, they're the ones that deceive him. And then we have the death and resurrection. That's what leads to the exalted Lord. That's how Jesus gets his authority. He gets his authority through suffering, right? And that becomes that model for believers, right? Whereas, how do we then become all that God wants us to be? We don't do so by just trying to grasp power and just trying to rule over people, but we do so by humbling ourselves, serving, and through that humility and service, that's how we get exalted. That's the model. That's the Christological model. That's what Jesus does. He dies as an act of humility and service. And because of that, he gets raised from the dead. He gets the authority. And then he commissions the church to carry on his work and assures us of his presence. Any questions about this? Any questions about this ending of Matthew's narrative?
I just have one question. It's the guards report. Like, how could Matthew know the guards report?
That's a great question.
The other parts, obviously, there's witnesses there, but how could he know the guards report?
That's a great question. And my thought is that the report was already circulating that Jesus's body had got. You got these kind of narratives that's going, right? It's only the believers that believe that he got resurrected and those who saw. The religious leaders, they don't want that. Whether they believed it and just denied it or they just didn't believe it at all, they don't want that story floating. This is why the evidence that's consistent, that's historical without a shadow of doubt, is that that tomb was empty. That evidence is there, consistent. Everybody can agree on that. That's historical. The question becomes, why is it empty? And I think that for Matthew, he knows that the counter narrative is that the disciple stole his body. Now, did somebody tell him the story? Hey, we heard the religious leaders say that, the guards, they paid the guards. Most likely, like how they come up on these stories, most likely originally they were circulated orally and then they got written down. But somewhere around there, this one about the stolen body became a big one for Matthew, which is why, for the most part, his resurrection narrative is all about countering that. From the fact of the sealing of the tomb, putting the guards there, all of that is countering this idea that the body was stolen. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, that's a great question. Those are the kind of questions I like wrestling with, right? So we'll look at Luke 23:50, and we'll read all the way through the end of that chapter. Read Luke's resurrection narrative. And Luke tells a different story. Luke is dealing with different things, right? he has different themes that he's bringing into that resurrection narrative. And we also have to understand that Luke is going to tell he has 2 volumes, right? So he's not going to end it at the end of his gospel, but he also has Acts. So Luke is also already thinking about what he's going to do in Acts when he's telling his story of the resurrection in chapter 24. Okay, let me do this.